On behalf of the American Society, Council of the Americas, I would like to welcome you to this timely and important conversation on energy and NAFTA. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge our partners for this event, the New York Energy Forum and the Canadian Consulate in New York. Thank you for your support in making this event a reality. My name is Christian Gomez, and I am the Director of the Energy Program at the Council of the Americas in the Washington, D.C. office. In Washington, I run an Energy Action Group, which is a public-private dialogue of leading energy experts who meet regularly to come up with best practices and actionable solutions to the most pressing energy issues in the hemisphere. Just last week, we held the latest meeting of the Energy Action Group in Mexico City, where we convene experts from the public and private sectors for a discussion on natural gas and renewable energy in Mexico. This meeting follows previous events in Brasilia and, more importantly, Calgary, where we have published reports as an output of the conversations. Today we are looking at the North American energy picture, which has come a long way since NAFTA was signed 20 years ago. Even looking back 5 to 7 years, we could not have predicted how North America could have shifted from relative energy scarcity to abundance. With the oil sands in Canada, the shale revolution in the United States, and energy reforms in Mexico, it is likely that North America will continue to develop its posture as an energy superpower. How North America integrates in terms of energy will go a long way in determining each nation's success individually. The North American Leaders Summit last month demonstrated that each country has a commitment to deeper integration, as shown by the establishment of a trilateral energy ministerial later this year. Our expert panel this evening will be discussing these and other issues. Before we turn it over to them, I would like to introduce Mr. John F. Prado, Consul General of Canada in New York, who has been in this position since March of 2011. Prior to his duties as Consul General in New York, Mr. Prado had a distinguished career in the financial sector, including stints at TD Securities and the TD Capital Group. I will now turn it over to Mr. Prado.
Thank you, Christian. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Je vous souhaite tous le bienvenu pour une soirée que je suis certain ça va être très, très intéressant sur un sujet qui est très important pour nos pays. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight, and I'm honored to be Canada's Consul General in the greatest city in the world and to be in this historic building to discuss a topic that is not only important but has become even more relevant in the course of the last few weeks. We're here tonight to discuss North American energy policy, and we're doing it in the occasion of the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. But first, the Consulate General of Canada would like to extend our sincere thanks to our partners and friends at both the American Society and the New York Energy Forum, both parties that we've done many events over the course of the last few years. Canada, the United States, and Mexico are excellent hemispheric partners on a wide shared group of interests, and we also deal with many of the same continental challenges. Since the inception of NAFTA in 1994, building on the success of the previous Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, our nations have forged much more important and also much more complex relationships. These partnerships or relationships have been the source of prosperity, growth, employment, and hemispheric prosperity. By any measure that you look at, NAFTA has been an incredible success. When we look at the progress from 1993 to today, you will see it both in terms of the growth in the North American economy and trade. When we look at trade, first of all, we see that prior to NAFTA, we had trade between our three countries of $289 billion. In 2012, it was in excess of $1.1 trillion. That's a 3.5-fold increase. When we look at the North American continent and its economic size, we see an economy that went from roughly $8 trillion prior to NAFTA to in excess of $19 trillion in 2012. Cooperation through NAFTA has also created North America where our behavior, our economic behavior has also changed. We no longer simply sell goods to each other, we make things together. We are part of an integrated supply chain, which is a vast difference from simple trade between parties. NAFTA was, in its reality, the first of a comprehensive trade agreement of its type, and has been a valuable example of the benefits of trade liberalization for the rest of the world. We in North America know and understand that free trade means prosperity, jobs, and economic growth. Looking further, one of the most crucial aspects of this relationship in this continent is the role that energy policy will play. Each of the three countries has been blessed with incredible natural resources. And we have an opportunity now to start thinking of how this continent can become much more competitive through the effective use of our resources. But whenever we talk about resources and energy, we also talk about the responsibility, and that is the environment and climate change. We are natural partners because concerns about water, land, and air or emissions do not stop at man-made borders, nor do our shared values. We are facing these challenges and seeking out the possible opportunities together as neighbors and allies as North America looks to continue to provide leadership on the world stage. And that is why we're here today. The implications of recently accessible resources, the commitment to renewable power and sustainability, the role of nuclear energy, the demands of robust economies, each of these issues are driving debate and spurring technology in a multitude of countries. There is much that we can learn from each other, and there are many more opportunities for deepening these partnerships as we learn to navigate our energy and our economic realities. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our speakers and to the discussions with you, energy experts and North American watchers, with different perspectives and insights that will help advance our collective dialogue. I'd like to give special thanks to our Canadian speakers, Robert Skinner of the University of Calgary and Monique Gattinger of the University of Ottawa for joining us today. And thanks to the America Society and the New York Energy Forum for their partnership in this event. I'm now pleased to turn the evening over to our moderator, David Knapp. David?
Thank you, John. Well, let me tell you a bit. First, let me add my welcome from the Energy Forum, which I'm on the board of and recently been saddled with the presidency of. And a lot of you here, I think, know the Energy Forum well. But we're very honored. This is my first visit to this building as well, to be doing something with the Americas Society, Council of the Americas. And we've done a lot, as Mr. Prado said, with the Canadian Consulate, with Gaboy, and with some of the rest of you. So these are great relationships for the Energy Forum, and hopefully we can bring something to the table. And so when the idea of NAFTA came up, we said basically, well, a lot of it's about energy. So we need to have an energy program, and we'd be happy to moderate it and to try to help put it together. So that's why I'm here and why we're here. Our speakers, I have asked, and by the way, I'm Charlie Rose from here on out. This is a conversation. This is a debate if it turns into that. This is an audience participation exercise as well. And we've kind of divided the time into three chunks. In the first, I'm going to have each of these speakers give a short intervention on energy and NAFTA and what that means to them. A bit of the theme of the program is where we are. Sort of a sub-theme is how we got here. And I think Bob Skinner might say, and could it actually happen now like it did back then? The last part of it is going to involve you guys. So please think about questions. We will have some microphones, so stick your hand up. I'll recognize people in hopefully a sensible order with a certain amount of fairness to sides and things like that. And someone will give you a microphone. Please identify yourself so we know who you are and where you're from. And also, it's better if it's a question. We don't mind comments, but we don't want dissertations. So be good about that. And with that, I'm not going to introduce the speakers formally because their bios are already here. So, Monica.
Thank you very much, David. It's funny that you should say that, because as a professor, I often say to students, I don't want comments, I want dissertations.
Exactly.
It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I thank all of the organizers of this event for the opportunity to come and speak with you this evening. I'm delighted to look out into the crowd and see a lot of young people here, which is also terrific, and perhaps that will ensure that there will be some understanding of the title that I would give my brief little intervention here tonight. As we know, and as was mentioned, the shale gale in the United States is really transforming the North American energy picture. And I recently wrote a blog on this topic in the wake of the North American Leaders Summit, and I titled it "Shale Gale or Shale Fail? Will North America's Leaders Miss the Boat on Energy?" And so my comments tonight are going to expand on that blog a little bit here for you. So there's really three things that I want to talk about. The first of which is to really give some time to where have we been. Right, so since NAFTA, where have we been when it comes to energy policy making? And my main point there is that energy policy making has become increasingly complex, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Then I want to talk about where are we now, and really focus in on some of the reasons that we're here tonight, I would argue, which is that we've got rapid, wide-scale change in the North American energy picture, which is introducing tremendous uncertainty into energy markets, but also political uncertainty as well. And then finally, I will talk about a little bit looking forward, so looking ahead. Will we have a shale gale in North America that will lead to improved opportunities around energy, or will we see a shale fail? And I'll give some comments. I'll give some comments on that. My main point there, though, that is if we look at energy in the current period through a trade policy lens, it's too narrow of a lens to bring to this issue, and I'll unpack that in a moment. So where have we been? Since NAFTA, so in the last 20 years, energy policy making has become increasingly complex. I do not envy energy policymakers in contemporary times. It's not an easy job. As a student and observer of energy policy, I love exploring and observing the challenges and the changes. In essence, governments, in my view, are in search of what I refer to as the Holy Grail when it comes to energy policy making, and trying to address four key imperatives around energy. The first of which is markets. Trying to make sure that we've got energy markets that function in a competitive, efficient fashion. Right? So a lot of the focus of NAFTA, and prior to that the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and domestically in Canada and the United States, was really on trade liberalization, deregulation, price deregulation in the energy sector, and trying to get, in essence, liberalize energy markets. But a number of imperatives have added on to the energy imperatives over time. The second of which was mentioned by our Consul General, environment. Right, so increasingly challenging issues around the environmental implications of energy exploration, production, distribution, use, consumption, transmission, et cetera, you name it. There are tremendously challenging issues in terms of the environmental implications of energy. Everything from species at risk, air quality, and of course the challenge of all, as was mentioned, climate change. So market, environment. Third, energy security. Right, and we know that here in North America, particularly in the United States, the ebb and flow of political interest and concerns around energy security, right, and whether that's in terms of security of supply, trying to ensure that there's some sort of buffer against price shocks and volatility in the energy sector. And that, as we know, has ebbed and flowed over time. And then the final imperative, and this is the one that we're really seeing over the last number of years. When I started studying energy, it was a pretty humdrum area. It is no longer a humdrum area. There's tremendous political interest of individual citizens, of NGOs, you name it, in energy projects of various descriptions. And the interest, as we know, is often opposition to energy projects. And so that trying to ensure, when it comes to the development of energy policy, that energy policy is developed in a way that's socially acceptable has become that fourth imperative. So if you take those four imperatives, which have really layered on one another over time, we've got market, environment, security, and social acceptability, and they form this handy little acronym, MESS. So what sort of mess are governments going to make of energy policy? Will it be a mess in the sense of disorder and disarray, or a mess in the sense of a mess hall, where people come together to meet their shared needs? I'll come back to that in a minute. So where are we now? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to really be looking at where we're going to be going. But as we know, shale oil and gas and the rapid and largely unanticipated expansion in predominantly US production in oil and gas is transforming the North American energy picture. You don't have to go back that many years, and I go to energy events like this on a pretty regular basis. These issues were not discussed. I mean, I can think back to events just sort of 5, 6, 7 short years ago where the discussion was we're facing increasing natural gas shortages in North America. We've got large numbers of proposals on the table for LNG import facilities. Now, as we know, some of those permits are being repurposed into potentially export facilities. So we've gone from hydrocarbon scarcity, as was mentioned, to abundance in North America, particularly in the United States. The US, as many of you know, is now the largest oil and gas producer in the world. Who would have thunk it? And is on track to reach its historic peak of oil production of close to 10 million barrels a day in the next couple of years. That, you'd have to go back to 1970 for that peak. So we're looking at a tremendous, tremendous change. Having a lot of economic impacts, positive economic impacts in terms of trade balances, economic development, jobs, et cetera, but a lot of uncertainty in energy markets as well. From a Canadian perspective then, this is really interesting to watch. And the challenge then, I think, is that there's increasing debate in the Canadian context around what this means for the future of Canada-US energy relations, right? Because it begins to potentially call into question the size and viability of the US appetite for Canadian energy exports. And I'll spare you some of the statistics here, but certainly the extent to which the US is reliant on petroleum imports is going down and is marching down at a very, very rapid pace. The Canadian gas exports to the United States are marching down at a very rapid pace. We're beginning to import increasing volumes of natural gas from the US. And when it comes to the oil sands, one of the challenges there, of course, is that we've got price differentials and challenges for producers in the oil sands when it comes to accessing marketplace. So what this has done in the Canadian context particularly is really reorient and begin to create substantial debates and actual energy projects, proposals for energy projects, to reorient energy flows and infrastructure in North America. You would have to go back to the 1950s to see this many major energy pipeline proposals on the table right now, whether it's in the Canada-US or the Canadian context, really reorienting from north-south, potentially to east-west. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment as well. So looking ahead, will the shale gale lift all boats, energy boats in North America, or will we be looking at a shale fail? And I think my main message for tonight, and I'd be happy to unpack it more in our discussion, is that if we use an exclusively trade lens on this issue, it's too narrow of a lens. The challenges before us, the opportunities before us go far beyond trade. Energy is a commodity, in my view, unlike any other. Right? This is an input into industrial activity, into quality of life, standards of living. Right? So the energy platform, if you will, in North America, that energy architecture in North America can contribute in positive ways, in important ways, to North American competitiveness, quality of life, standards of living, and particularly in the context of an increasingly regionalized and competitive global economy. So in my view, the questions and the issues that we need to be talking about go beyond trade. We need to be thinking about what should the North American energy future look like, right? How can we best capitalize upon the vast energy resources that we have here in North America? And that goes beyond, of course, oil and gas to include hydro and other sources of electricity generation. In order to address some of these fundamental questions, I have some ideas there, but my sense is that it's going to be really important for governments to begin to take a leadership role in this area. We have what I would think of as, in essence, a classic collective action problem. Folks in industry know this stuff, but their sort of their time horizon and the focus of their interests is not necessarily going to go to talking about some of those broader questions that we know are questions of public interest. And so governments, I think, need to begin to be a little bit more active, I would argue much more active in this area, and begin to work on ways in which the three countries of North America can work together to try to capitalize on the shale revolution that's before us, other energy sources that we know that we have here in North America, and begin to think through how can we profitably develop those in a way that is affordable, sustainable, efficient, safe, competitive, all of the key characteristics that we would like to see what I would refer to as the energy architecture in North America to look like. I'll stop there and I'll look forward to
I was going to say that would be a good place to stop,
Yeah.
and you're stopping. That's terrific. Thank you very much. That's a great summary, and I think it brought up a lot of issues that I want you to start thinking about. Markets, obviously, I'm a PhD economist, so I love it to be about markets. And when you look at the problem about the rate of development in Western Canada, it's about markets, and it's about linking markets to the people that are going to use it and things like that. And so your points are very well taken. I might also point out that there are three parties in the NAFTA agreement, Canada and the US and Mexico. They are not being excluded from this meeting, but given the amount of stuff that's happening, evidently most of them are really busy understanding markets, which is kind of a new thing for them, and politics in a very different guise than it has been in the future, in the past. And so the Mexican future, I think they are looking very interestingly at what's going on in the two neighbors to the north and how they got to where they are, and how Mexico, which is in the current guise a declining producer of oil, not so much with gas, who does have shale resources but doesn't have a clue about developing in very dry areas that in the northern part that the Eagle Ford gets into. So they want to learn from the US and from Canada. And they have learned a great deal over the past number of years. And I know both Amish and Bob have had a lot of interactions with Mexican energy specialists and energy diplomats over the years, as have I. So Mexico is here in spirit, if not in person. And with that, Amish.
Thank you. And again, thank you to everybody for hosting this event. And it's a pleasure to have a good opportunity, good excuse to come back to my hometown in New York, so even if it's just for the day. As we talk about, when I saw the invitation on NAFTA 20, and I came to Washington to work on Capitol Hill on the House Foreign Affairs Committee just after the vote on NAFTA, and I was working for a fairly liberal member of Congress who was at the time about to be the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the legacy of the vote on NAFTA stayed with me my entire tenure of 10 years in both the House and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committees. And as we talk about NAFTA 20, I think that sometimes we lose the perspective of how gut-wrenching, how difficult that was of a discussion on the Hill and in the country, and the famous debates of Al Gore and Ross Perot, and how today we talk about these statistics and the integration, and yeah, there are comments about in the press that you see about the negative aspects of it, but really it's not how much has changed in the debate over this issue, and the integration of the three countries to me is phenomenal. It literally marks the day that I arrived in Washington on the policy scene. I think that before I get into talking a little bit about that issue of North American energy, I think it's important to put it in context. And I think to some degree, an indication of what you had talked about before, the State Department has always had a number of people working on energy. But it was a relative small number of people working in a variety of different offices, some connected to each other, some not. We had an envoy for Europe and Eurasia. We had an office in the Economic Bureau that was sanctions and energy sort of combined. But about 4 years ago, Secretary Clinton decided that we needed to look as part of the quadrennial diplomacy and development review, which was copying the Defense Department's policy of every 4 years looking what are the challenges ahead that we're not organized to look at today. What are we bureaucratically and policy-wise not thinking about that we should be based on the future? The first recommendation out of that was that we needed to create an energy bureau, basically a division inside the State Department that will be dedicated in a concerted, comprehensive way to the variety of ways that we look at energy. And when I was called in to see her before I started, I asked her why, and she said, look, we connect all our dots on foreign policy in this country. I can connect them through energy. We talk about development and assistance programs, and if you can't create an area with affordable, reliable sources of energy, you're never going to create an opportunity for development of a small economy and a small business class. You can't do that. You need that assurances. On climate change and environment, as previous speakers have talked about it. And on national security and foreign policy, where energy hydrocarbons are found, sometimes are in challenging areas. And sometimes they're interlinked in a greater and greater way to the geopolitics. And finally, how do we bring in the economy of tomorrow, the energy of tomorrow? Clearly, we're going to be hydrocarbon dependent for a very long time. But we have to start at some point thinking in a government together with other countries. We're not going to be able to do this alone in the United States or alone in our hemisphere. This is going to have to be a collaborative and international effort. And to do that, we need people who understand the energy markets, to understand the private sector, to understand the NGO world, to understand the foreign policy implications and national security implications. And that's why we need people at the foreign policy table that understand these issues and can bring it all together. And today we have about 85 to 90 people in the State Department that work solely on those different areas, including transparency and good governance and all these other issues. With that in mind, the first speaker, our Consul General, and David talked about where we are today. We're sitting here talking about North America, but North America, you can't talk about North American energy in isolation of what's happening around the world. And the trends, both the trends that are happening in energy around the world and what's been keeping me busy for the last 2.5 weeks or so, which is Russia, Ukraine, and every country that is dependent on Russia via Ukraine. And my travel schedule over the last 2.5 weeks has been entirely in that area. But it all gets interconnected. And we're in the middle of two dynamics happening at the very same time, by coincidence, but they're happening at the same time. And one is that for historic reasons, we are moving away from the demand structure that we've seen over the last several decades, and that is the OECD countries leading the demand, to today non-OECD countries leading demand, and that will be the case into the future. At the same time, supply side is also changing, and away from the traditional OPEC-dominated supply to more and more newcomers to the energy production business, who have no interest in joining OPEC or for anybody to tell them how much to produce and when. And that is changing a lot of these dynamics that we're referring to today. And of course, one of the key drivers in that is the United States. And as these efforts were happening, we are seeing a huge boom that I don't need to explain because everybody in this room is well aware of, not only in gas, but in oil. And that has enabled us to connect those issues into our foreign policy and to ask the question that the United States, as bizarrely as it seems, is probably more behind the 8 ball than any other country in thinking about what does that mean for our foreign policy. Wherever I go, whether I meet with leaders in the Middle East, in the Gulf, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, everybody talks about what are the impacts, and they tell me what their view of the impact is. In the Middle East, because we're producing more oil and gas, we have left the Middle East, and we have no interest in the Middle East anymore, and that's why we're gone, let alone the Fifth Fleet and the thousands of people that we have there, and Secretary Kerry's travel schedule, and our strategic importance in the Middle East. But we're leaving the Middle East because we have our own oil and gas. In Europe, we are about to save Europe because we're going to open the floodgates and send remarkable amounts of gas to Europe that will decrease our dependency on Russia, and so on and so forth. And that is the context, but we ourselves are still struggling with this question. But as we talk about all these different regions around the world, one of the things that comes up often in intergovernmental meetings that I keep raising is as we talk about those regions, we seem not to talk enough as a government about this region. And when we do, it's through very particular lenses of a project, this project or that project, a specific issue that's coming up that we have to deal with. Unrest in Venezuela, let's talk about North America. But it's not as the fact that this is the most important region. These two countries, Canada and Mexico, are the most important countries to the United States when it comes to energy, bar none. They're our first and second largest trading partners in energy. We have flows going in both directions. And I think that, as been said before, it's true that the dynamic of the trade is changing and that we may be decreasing some of our imports from Canada, but we are still the main trading partner and for the foreseeable future. And discussing how that changes is important, but recognizing the importance of those two countries to our energy existence and our energy thinking. We talk a lot about in the press about energy independence, and it's something that we try to fight very hard against that term. We fail, by the way. It's everywhere. America, energy independence. Our people talk about it, everybody talks about it. But the truth is that a disruption anywhere in the world will have a great impact everywhere, including the United States, even if we continue to march along and produce far more oil than we do. But together, Canada and Mexico supply us, since we are yet not even self-reliant, supply us with roughly 38% of all our petroleum imports. That blows away anything else that we get from anywhere, from any other country. So then you have to think about, okay, 20 years to NAFTA, what's next? Where are we going from here? And beyond the pessimistic challenge that I have from my fellow speaker about the premise of how will government screw this up, we're hoping not to, and that's good news. Yes, and we are putting some effort into it, and we have to look at what does that mean, the relationship. Is it just a trading relationship? And I believe that it is not. This is a strategic relationship between the three countries that is important not only for our own economies. We have both a responsibility and it's in our own interest to work together towards what's happening right around us in the rest of our hemisphere, and specifically right at the edge of our borders. And let me use this to bring three things and then I'll stop. The first is between the United States and Mexico, still on the bilateral area, even before the reforms come into place, after decades of talking about it but going nowhere. Over the last couple of years, we've reached a remarkable agreement with Mexico that got just as remarkable little press, and that was a transboundary agreement between the US and Mexico. We've been negotiating this off and on for years, but we actually concluded it, had it ratified in the Mexican Parliament and in Congress just a few months ago, finally. And we now have opened up an area between our two countries in the water for offshore development that will allow for what we've signed is essentially a unitization framework agreement that allows companies from both sides to work together even outside the frame of the new reforms. But there are two other areas that are not about the US, Mexico, or Canada, but rather about how the US, Mexico, and Canada need to work together. And that is, we have the Caribbean countries, islands, that have a very difficult challenge facing them. It is not easy to find solutions for energy security for the Caribbean islands because of their size, because of their location, and because of the form of their economy. But we need to work together, which is what we're doing. And if you see, that came out of the statement of the North American leaders in the last summit, of how do we work together to help the Caribbean develop and create that energy security, especially under the very worrisome changing environment that their energy supply comes from, and see how we work together to make sure that the private sector and the government can work together. How do we leverage government action, government willingness to engage together as a region with bringing in the private sector to make the necessary investments and the environment and climate in which they can invest. And the second is an effort that was launched originally by Colombia and that has been cheer-led by the President of the United States and by others in the hemisphere, and we are working very hard on with the support of some of the hosts of this event, and that is the Connect 2022, Connecting the Americas 2022. And the idea being that how do we look at working together, Canada with the United States and Mexico, with our different, with the different values that we bring, the different attributes that we can supply, to help the integration of energy-rich countries who sit side by side with energy-poor countries, And how do we work to make sure that the private sector, once again, gets what they need from us to enable them to have that environment for investment, so that we together, as looking at what we've been able to accomplish in 20 years of NAFTA, can then push that out so that we can grow the hemisphere around us and lead for far more economic integration, economic trade, and ultimately lifting all those boats as we do that. And that takes leadership. And I believe that we currently have the leadership in all three countries that is not only willing but able and committed to working on these issues. What we're seeing in Mexico over the last several months has been remarkable, one that I think that an effort that we would not have been able to see or thought we would see on reform. And we have been watching and looking, and I think this is well on its way to being complete. But this is part of that process of opening up the door to this further integration and working together to lead the region. I'll say just one last thing about some of the comments that were made, and I think that was an excellent presentation. We, despite all the different changes that are happening, it's just so important to underscore over and over the relationship of Canada and Canada and the United States on this issue. And you talked about the pipelines that are all across, and I'll talk about all of them but one. But I think that it's remarkable how little is known about the remarkable amount of investment in infrastructure that is both required and happening. And that while the press and some of the commentators attach to one event or another, in my office there's one group of people that all they do is they look at applications for pipelines, small pipelines, interconnectors, renewals, and so on. That has become a much bigger business than we thought, and we had to budget it accordingly. But there's so much exciting work that means that energy investment and the energy boom that's happening in the United States and in Mexico and the changes in Canada mean that the investment that we do in these areas is far-reaching beyond energy into infrastructure and construction jobs, and it permeates throughout the economy, and it allows for all kinds of integration. And ending just on the note that as we talk about oil and gas, we're also talking about those fuels of the future. And I think it's how do we integrate and how do we take advantage of what's happening in the United States, on shale gas in particular, to allow us to invest more in those fuels of the future. And some of the examples that I saw were remarkable, and just use one, that wind farms in North Dakota being used to pump water upstream in Ontario for future hydropower use on both sides of the border. Or the wind projects across the border in Mexico that was all going to be constructed there, but the electricity is going to be used in the United States. And that's part of that integration of working together across border that people, I think, in the United States at least, I don't know enough the polling and other data in Canada and Mexico, but I think it's underestimated how much we are already integrated when it comes to our power grids, when it comes to some of our efforts that are very close to the border, if you look at North Dakota or in California. And I think that one of the things that we need to do as a government, it's upon us to work with organizations such as the host tonight and the private sector and the business community to get that message out there a little bit better. We're already interconnected, we're already integrated. And what we need to do is to harness that to make it stronger, to face the future, and to integrate the rest of the region as we did our three countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think there's a couple of things that I absolutely agree with, and the idea you have to broaden the context. It's called a free trade agreement. If you're an autarky, you've got the internal trade, but that's not what that's about. It's about the fact that we're in a big world. We're a trading bloc in that world. Certainly in the oil universe, it's moving a bit to the east, both on supply and demand, as he's pointed out. But our reaction to that isn't necessarily to disassociate with the world because we are, quote, energy independence. And I started my career in 1973 going to something called Project Independence. And to this day, I went in and I said, I'm an economist. I said, have any of you guys ever heard of comparative advantage? Take the cheap oil, make stuff, sell it back at a profit, and the world works well. The other thing is, which he alluded to in passing, is this tension that's developed about this energy independence and the idea that we're going to be free of imports by 2020 or 25 or whatever is going in the wrong direction. I mean, that kind of policy making based on that kind of assumption that that's the appropriate goal is going to run counter what the free trade agreement was about. So we're going to finish with another Canadian perspective from a guy that was there on the other side of the table in a way from Amish's experience in the U.S. legislature. And this is an old friend of mine who I had the pleasure of working with at the International Energy Agency in the 90s. So Dr. Bob.
Thanks, David. I think the emphasis was on the word old. But I want to join my colleagues on the panel in commending the Council and the Forum and the Canadian Consulate for putting this event together. NAFTA, yes, it's an important event. It's not an important event in terms of energy. And nor was the free trade agreement, the bilateral free trade agreement, in my view. I come at this with an arc of experience that goes back to I guess as a young geologist on the Athabasca River in 1966 when I first saw the oil sands. And at that time, the first major contemporary, at least, oil sands project was under construction, and nobody talked about it. I made a provocative statement that I don't think NAFTA was important because many of the structural policy changes that were important to the energy sector were done prior to the free trade agreement. And if I look at that arc of time from the 1960s when we in Canada had the national oil policy, when we bought into the higher, in effect, regulated price in the United States in order to sell the crude that was coming out of a new and phenomenal production play in Alberta. And we were begging the United States to take our oil, and it wasn't easy because the United States was very protective, trying to keep Venezuelan oil out in particular, but we managed to get some concessions in that oil regime. And it was difficult, except during the Suez crisis, when it was less difficult to sell oil to the United States. Then, and if you look at the percentage of Canadian oil as a percentage of U.S. Oil consumption, in 1973 is around 6%. And then U.S. oil demand dropped and our oil supply dropped because of policy decisions, and we thought we were running out of oil, and so we withdrew licenses and so on for exports. 1981 is when the U.S. hit about 15 million barrels a day in terms of consumption, and our contribution to that was at its lowest, around 2%. And then after a spurt, it rose, and actually it rose partly, I think, because of one of the programs that I administered. I was the administrator for the Canadian oil pricing system in the National Energy Program, and I'm proud to say I was the deregulator of that system later on. But we had something called the new oil reference price for new wells, new oil, and so that actually spurred activity, and you can see that an increase in oil supply to the United States. And then there was a long, slow climb until about 2005, and then the annual production or the annual contribution to the United States supply went from about 60,000 barrels a day per year on average to twice that, about 120,000 barrels a day after 2005, and it's now 14% of your oil consumption and 26% of your oil imports, and taking off. Now, why did that happen? Well, again, we come back to policy changes and the history. And I would say that the decision by Pierre Elliott Trudeau on September 4th, 1974, to freeze the domestic oil price, to actually ask the industry not to pass on to consumers the rise in prices, and then the Yom Kippur War a month later, froze in that for 11 years to the day when the Mulroney government was voted in on September 4th, 73 to 84, and he came to power in a climate that was, look, we've had enough of national strategies for everything and national policies for everything, and there was very much a spirit of interest in liberalized markets for transportation, and getting rid of state-owned companies, etc. And I think there was a window of resistance, or that is the resistance against reciprocity going back to 1911, 1930. There was another attempt or a thought of having a free trade agreement with the United States was put aside. But it softened in that important area after about 1984. And I think the free trade agreement snuck through. And the only thing that it did really in energy was foreclose against ever doing another national energy program, foreclose against doing what the United States did in the 70s in terms of oil allocations, and on volume and price regulations. And another thing, it brought that market-oriented energy policies to Canada. And I suppose I had a hand in drafting the current energy policy of Canada. It's the shortest policy we've ever had, and it's the longest lived. And I had a hand in some respects in it, certainly administering the longest, most complex energy policy that we had, and was probably the shortest lived. And that was a national energy program, because we started revising it within months because it was not viable. And so I guess I'm laying out a card, Monica, that I now find myself having gone full circle. I'm back in academia, and I'm going to be quite adamant that I think a national energy strategy is about as viable as an international energy strategy, and a hemispheric or a continental. And before I forget, because of my age, I would think that what is going on in Mexico at this very moment, can anyone here imagine that the Mexican government would be able to sell what it's doing in the reform of the petroleum sector in Mexico if it were under the guise of some pacto energético continental? I don't think so. That would be the kiss of death if it was part of some pact. There was an important decision made too that by governments on both sides. Governments supported R&D. In Canada, we've been supporting R&D in the oil sands, almost as a national security issue, going back way back in the 1800s, and then revitalized in the 70s during the oil crisis. And that eventually led to the confirmation of the steam-assisted gravity drainage technology to produce the oil sands using steam from wells, as opposed to the mining, which is not very pretty, only to a mining engineer. And on the U.S. side, the DOE, it sponsored hydraulic fracturing R&D back in the late 70s and through the 80s, and that eventually led to with the conflation of hydraulic fracturing and long-reach horizontal wells, we have the shale gale. And those two phenomena. Now, coming back at the 90s, after the free trade agreement, the policy of the day was free markets. We're not going to give out handouts. We couldn't possibly do the oil sands projects the way we had been doing them in the 70s. There's long, protracted trilateral discussions and negotiations between the province of Alberta and maybe the Saskatchewan province for an upgrader, for example, and the industry or industry consortia, each with their own bottom lines and objectives, to come up with some kind of fiscal royalty loan guarantee package to make an oil sands project. And so we changed the royalty and fiscal regime for the oil sands in 1996. The first commercial plant using SAGD was started in 1999. And by the early 2000s, we had two or three commercial plants. And that's why after 2005, we see that uptick of 120,000 barrels per day of supply to the United States. And it's heavy stuff. And it's triggered a lot of investment in the US refining sector. Canada today is producing, or last month produced 4.3 million barrels a day of hydrocarbon liquids. Go down the OPEC list. That scores pretty well with any OPEC producer, and it's growing apace. In terms of the future, like the United States, Canada is having to diversify and turn its attention to where the markets are, and that's not the United States, as previous speakers have said. We have to look at Asia, as is the United States. We can't rely, obviously, growing like that, we cannot rely on a market that itself is producing oil at an increment of about 1 million barrels a day per year, while its demand is languishing at best. We need new markets. And that brings me to the policy issues that we have in Canada, and that is within Canada, between provinces, and between regions. And that's a domestic challenge that we can talk about. I think I'll leave it there, and we can have questions and discussion.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's interesting that when you talked about the most complicated and the shortest lived versus vice versa, that there's a very good Dutch economist named Jan van Meers that's done some econometric work looking at the number of pages and intricacies, et cetera, of upstream fiscal terms and corruption. And there's a very direct correlation. I mean, it's complicated because people don't want it to be easy for people to figure it out and maybe to use it correctly. And so congratulations on a short one. I could say something about Simpson Bowles too for US budgets, but that's a different deal. Now we're going to get into the next section, which is us kind of talking among ourselves. But again, I sort of put the burden on you to be thinking about good questions that you need to ask. One thing that I'll ask Amos, when you talk about the Caribbean, is this as an extension of NAFTA to move to the south? Or is it NAFTA relating to an outside group? I mean, there is a trade agreement between the US and the Caribbean. And is the motivation really about saving the poor people of the islands, or is it a reaction to Petro-Carib, the old San Jose agreement that Mexico and Venezuela would give subsidized or swap-related oil to some of the developing countries in the region, and obviously the political fight for South America between the Chavez and the sort of left-wing forces versus Colombia and some of the U.S. friends there, obviously and rightfully gets a lot of attention. But a bit of Monroe Doctrine in there, and if we could have a fight afterwards if you want, but. What's your reaction to that? Is it about expanding NAFTA to be more countries, or is it about using NAFTA as a trade group dealing with other trade groups?
I don't see it as part of, I see NAFTA really in this conversation, in this context, as setting a tone for what can be done when you put together a regime that governs, that changes our regulatory processes and allows for free trade to flow and all the different positive impacts on trade over the last 20 years as we look to other issues, but not necessarily in the context of expanding NAFTA to the Caribbean. We have a free trade agreement with the Caribbean, as you mentioned. This is really more looking at it as in isolation of that conversation, and really looking at it as these are countries on our border, on our joint border, the three countries, right south of us, of the United States. We have to look, I think, in what we've learned, I think, from the last few weeks, or what we should be learning, and what I believe that we actually learned a long time ago, but we're now, the entire world is focused on this over the last few weeks, is about energy security and how important energy security is to overall economic growth and overall economic stability. And the two are interlinked. And as we look to the Caribbean as our friends, and we want to make sure that we work together to improve economies and to look towards a future where if there are any crises that you can imagine today, what would happen, what those consequences are, and therefore what work can we do today that would address those in advance and bring about some changes and look at what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Mexico and Canada as far as the boom in hydrocarbons overall and in renewable energy technology, and see how do we use some of the advancements that have been made in order to work with countries on our borders and our friends and neighbors to make that part of the solution. But as I said before, this is not about assistance dollars or AID type events or World Bank. This is about how do we come up with what are the right solutions, working with the private sector to make sure that the environment is there, the technology is there for that investment. So I don't really see it as part of an expansion of existing infrastructures, governmental structures, but rather how do we work together to address that problem that exists on our borders. And you mentioned a few things in your question that could be a cause for that grave concern, as we don't know what happens with Petrocaribbean. And I can avoid the question, but I think it's important to state. I'm not trying to predict what will happen, and maybe nothing will happen, and maybe all will continue as it was. But I think the idea of us as governments in the region not thinking about the contingency plan if something does change, and if there is a change in policy coming from Venezuela, what will that mean? And I think today that picture is not pretty, but we have to therefore have that conversation. I think the context of NAFTA in this, for me, is as we look at NAFTA is not only about what we've achieved in trade between the countries. It's brought us together, and we work well together, and we need to leverage our working together on a number of issues and expand that, and leverage that to working on new issues and new frontiers that are in the interest of the three countries and the region as a whole.
Okay.
I won't go into Monroe or anything else.
Exactly. Monica, what that was included in the other two presentations annoyed you the most?
Well, Bob, of course.
Surprise. And what's your answer to that? And that's that NAFTA doesn't matter, or that?
No, I don't disagree with that,
okay.
Actually. In an energy sense, as was mentioned, and I would agree with that, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was in essence, the last nail in the coffin of the National Energy Program and institutionalizing and formalizing free trade in energy that previously, in many instances, had already existed. So it was really putting. So I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that. Where I would respectfully offer an alternative view would be around the importance of working together. And I don't think the aim here would necessarily be a pacto energético. I'm more francophone than espagnol, clearly. It's really about, as was said in some of the presentations, and as I try to put forward, energy is a commodity unlike any other. It is a strategic resource, and it is one that is such an important input, whether it's into security, into other industries. There's the environmental components clearly as well. And I think, again, with due respect to governments, that we could be doing better. I absolutely agree with the point that was made around literacy. I mean, the Pew Research Center recently came out with a poll that was asking Americans about sort of the energy context in the U.S., and less than 1/3 of Americans were aware that energy production was increasing in the United States as a result of increasing oil and gas production. We have a problem. When it comes to trade, the biggest issue that tends to be facing industry is how do you get anything built? It's very challenging in the context of social opposition that's taking place. And as we know, social opposition over the last number of years has increased, or I would say sort of intensified, but also expanded in purview. Right? This is no longer exclusively the not in my backyard variety of opposition. It's principled opposition to the development of hydrocarbons writ large. Right? So people in the room might have heard of the acronym BANANA. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody, or nope, not on planet Earth. What's a policymaker to do? What's an industry to do faced with that? So when it comes to, let's say, for example, developing renewable resources, there's no shortage of, frankly, great projects that could go forward. But if looking east, for example, Hydro-Quebec, their Northern Pass project, which would, export volumes of electricity, renewable electricity, into New England, running into tremendous opposition. Right? And so I think there's a really strong role there for governments collaboratively to actually work on that energy literacy piece, and also to begin to, where we can, collaborate around what might the future look like around energy. I don't see any reason why we couldn't put in place, to try to move in that direction, something that could be a North American Energy Council, right, that would bring together industry, government, civil society to begin to look at some of these issues. I mean, their first task could be, what should the North American architecture look like? What could it look like? Develop a number of different scenarios around that. Those conversations perhaps are happening in informal channels, but they're not happening writ large. And the public opinion polling data in the Canadian context is equally frightening sometimes in terms of the relative lack of energy literacy when it comes to where, sort of the tremendous challenges and changes that are underway and what the future might look like. So that, I think, is really where we need to be moving beyond thinking about sort of the narrow cross-border issues and thinking about some of the broader questions so that we can move from an energy mess in the sense of disorder and disarray to a coming together to address some of those challenges collectively. And now I see that I've peeved you off, so I'm happy.
I'll make you wait for a minute. I'm going to ask Bob.
Okay.
Obviously, the big constraint about development of the oil sands at this point, besides the environmental attention it's getting, or the environmental attention coming in the side door, that pipeline, whose name we're not allowed to say, called Keystone XL, did NAFTA help or hurt the course of that pipeline getting built? If there hadn't been a NAFTA, would there have been as much or the same kind of opposition, or did NAFTA actually help get it done eventually, if it ever does get done eventually?
Well, I think in terms of foreign investment, it's helped. I mean, it's kind of reduced those barriers. I think NAFTA left a gap in terms of ensuring infrastructure and so on was being built.
Okay.
And I forget the wording and I forget the section that and it goes back to the free trade agreement actually, and it carried on. I think that's not, Keystone is not the only problem faced by the oil sands. We have costs going up and prices are flat. And sometimes they dip because of differentials. I mean, there are enormous cross subsidies going on in North America in the Canadian government estimated that the cross subsidy from Canadians to the U.S. about $13.3 billion in 2012, and between North Dakota and the rest, and so on. It's kind of because of these rigidities and the failure to get infrastructure in place. I mean, Canada and the U.S. has a very, very long history of cooperating on infrastructure strategically. I go back to the 1940s when we built the Canola oil pipeline to assist in the Pacific War, which at the time Japan was winning. And that line didn't last very long, but we saw common purpose in a strategic sense. In the 1950s, we saw common purpose when the Korean War, the U.S. assessed its success, its ability on Pad 5 on the West Coast. And it was crude short. Within a matter of months, we passed a bill in Canada and started construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline through the national parks and so on to the West Coast to take some of that oil I was telling you about that we were trying to sell to the United States.
That was 60s. Before the First Nations arrived, obviously.
The First Nations was not a term that existed. And it went through a UNESCO site, as did its enlargement, its expansion, the looping a few years ago through the Jasper National Park. In the 1960s, I mentioned the National Oil Program. In the 1970s, we signed a Northern Pipeline Treaty Agreement, and we rebuilt the Alaskan gas pipeline and loaned gas to the United States. I mean, there's a long history you can go through. And and to see the current stasis in terms of a pipeline project is, I mean, to people in the West, it's frustrating, to say the least. But,
Okay.
but I wanted to ask Monica, what is the shale fail that you see? You see the shale gales, the shale fail. I want to know what that means. Maybe we can come back to that.
Up to you. I'm happy to answer now, or if you want to go to.
Well, she can give the quick answer that they produce out so fast that there's going to be a major fracking incident that's going to put restraints on the ability to get the fluids down the hole, and that it's going to start to peter out, that it'll tip over earlier. Is that right?
Yeah, it wouldn't have actually been the answer I gave,
Okay.
but that's okay.
I got a note, I think it was from Wilbur, that snuck up here, that says, will the person with license number 20 minutes left per program to end ask Q&A next? Please move their car. So I will give you a chance at some point to counter it, but it may be over cocktails. It's now up to you guys. Okay, what was it? Is there anything that you really object to with what you heard, which I doubt? Is there something you want to reinforce? Is there something you didn't understand, which I would be surprised? Yes.
Mario Delosa with Bloomberg.
Wait for the mic.
Hi, yeah,
Yeah.
Mario Delosa with Bloomberg. I'm not on the press side, but in terms of the quality of the oil, you know, we're all familiar with the heavy sour and stuff. The coker processing capacity in the U.S. could basically justify taking all the Canadian, but it would come at the expense of either Mexican, Venezuelan, or Saudi. And given the ownership stakes of the respective three in refineries in the United States, how do you see that dynamic playing out?
No?
I think there's, as we look at, this is an area where the government's going to take, first of all, a backseat, because I do think that the unique thing about the United States is how private the sector is in comparison to no one. As we look at some of these developments, the market is now facing already a need to figure out how to adjust to the new differentials. And with the fact that the oil being produced out of the shale oil and is creating new, due to the grade and due to the lack of infrastructure that is able to connect it to both refineries and to other parts of the market in the United States, we're going to have some kind of adjustments here. And I think if you take a look over the last 2 years of the import picture to the United States, they've changed differently than what every analyst had predicted when I started reading this 2 years ago. What's going to happen if we have a lot more light sweet crude coming in with the lack of infrastructure? So I think it's true. I mean, you do have some of the refineries that are owned and operated by some of the the exporters who we're importing from. But at the end of the day, it's a dollars and cents game, and this is about making money. And they're going to have to figure out, nobody's going to take, I don't see those folks, except for maybe one, making this as a political decision, bar none, outside of the economic picture. And you're going to have to, I go back to a point that David made before about, are we ever going to be a country that does not import? And I believe we're always going to import.
Right.
Because of exactly because of part of the question that you just asked. We're going to have a swing here, and we're going to export some, and we're going to import others, and we're going to, even if we have this continued growth, we're going to continue to be a dynamic market. And whether or not the refineries have to change, or whether or not new players come in, or whether or not they change how they monetize their investments, that we'll have to see how that plays out. I'm not going to predict that. But I think that we're not going to stand in the way of doing that, which is already a change for us. And we're going to try to keep up with the demand and need for infrastructure investment that will enable that conversation to flow in a much more cohesive and in a much more rational way.
Well, you said Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and what was your third country?
Mexico.
Oh, and Mexico. Okay. Well, Mexico is sort of under the umbrella. Venezuela, for most of us, 0 would be a terrific number. And if they do sell off their refining assets, which they have been frankly threatening to do, if not trying to do for a while, and they've kind of gutted the management of the Citgo type stuff, and they're doing a lot of asphalt and things like that. But them going away doesn't cause any problem. The hard one is Saudi Arabia, obviously, because of their Motiva joint venture refinery with Shell. And they want to bring oil in that's kind of an Arab medium, so it's in between the heavy oil sand stuff and this light tight oil, which can in fact be blended, not always perfectly for a given refinery. But Saudi Arabia has a whole lot of US paper. And if you remember when the king came to visit Mr. Bush, it was don't sell our treasuries, don't sell our treasuries, don't sell our treasuries, don't kill the dollar. And stuff like that. So there's a lot of things about the Saudi relationship that aren't just about how much oil they bring into 4 or 5 refineries on the Gulf Coast. But thank you for making the point that quality matters, and that's why you have trade, because companies tend to sort that stuff out in ways that look like something that we like to call an optimum in economics, that it all works better if you do it on a free trade basis, and that's why U.S. oil ought to have gone out for a long time as crude in places where there was a meaningful, useful exchange because of different product slates and different other crudes that get blended in. So, next question. Back here.
Hello. I'm curious to hear how you guys feel about...
Who are you?
My name is Hugo. I'm a Columbia University student.
Yes.
CIPA.
I knew that, but they didn't.
Okay, and I'm curious to hear how you guys feel about subsidies and integration of the North American oil market, and how important it is to make incentives for the future energy projects that we might need, and how they might actually harm it.
Monica, you want to?
And how they might actually, I missed the last bit.
Harm future investments for the renewable energy.
I would argue at the moment, the key issue, certainly from the U.S. perspective, is much more about the increased production and decreased price in natural gas. I mean, that's having far more of an impact than any subsidy might in terms of renewable production. So we've seen, as certainly you would have the figures on this, but the reduction in GHG emissions in the electricity sector as a result of fuel switching, to coal. I think that's making far more. Fuel. Thank you. From coal to natural gas. And that I think is a challenge for the renewable sector in terms of moving forward. Right? In the U.S. context, there's the question then is, will natural gas be that bridge fuel, or will there be a sustained emphasis on natural gas, given that the projections going forward are extremely positive in terms of the ongoing supply side production of natural gas.
Bob, you had a comment?
Well, on the renewables, I mean, if you consider that the feed-in tariffs in Ontario are a form of subsidy, we have this rather aberrant situation where there are exports of electricity from the province that are at 1/3 the cost of production. And so normally that would trigger countervailing. But I guess America's not going to argue with cheap electricity, are you? Huh? So there are some, and we've mentioned before that Quebec has got a lot of hydroelectricity that actually is looking for a market, but because of interventions, renewable mandates and so on, it's kind of keeping that out. There are subsidies and there are subsidies. I mean, conscious government subsidies, I don't think you see very much of, at least at the national level. They're at the subnational level, they exist. Some argue that the tax regime, the fiscal royalty regime for the oil sands is subsidized, but normally they talk about oil subsidies. They're talking about on the consumer side in other countries, not in North America.
Yeah, and one of the tests might be, is the subsidy actually intervening in the market process, or is it something that's taking like a renewable technology which isn't there yet, which doesn't meet the cost barrier, and giving it a chance to move down the list so the basic markets are not being affected. Where you have big subsidies that are giving the wrong demand signals in producing countries, for instance, or where it's politics like in India, it's an incredibly bad idea, and it does a huge amount of damage. An interesting thing about NAFTA that I might make an observation that bad policy makes it across borders very easily, and good policy requires a lot of people sitting down and doing something like NAFTA. So,
But David, on subsidies, I think outside the North American context, globally, I think that subsidies is one of the biggest challenges that we face, bar none, in the energy security of the planet. We are seeing producing countries that if they don't change their habits, in 20 years from now will not be exporters, because they will be consuming all of their crude for electricity production. And largely because the only way to change that is introducing new fuels and so on, but it's change behavior. And you can't change behavior when, I went to Egypt a few months ago, and somebody told me the joke in Egypt was that you walk into a kitchen and the flame is on in the kitchen, but they're not cooking anything, and they asked, well, why is the flame on? And she says, well, matches cost a lot of money, gas is cheap. But it's a real problem. It's really indicative throughout the region and throughout the world, where we're actually seeing it it's getting worse, where there's more subsidies for both liquids and gasoline and electricity, and that's actually creating a big problem. The second part of it is, if you look in Europe and the experimentation in subsidies of renewables, I think there are certain countries in West Europe that would really have a lessons learned attitude to that question.
Why don't you take one over here, Wilda? I think there was one in the corner there.
There's a woman in the back.
One at the very back, the lady at the very back.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yes, well, and then you can get him next.
Great. Rachel Ziemba, Robini Global Economics. We are talking here about a NAFTA event, and NAFTA's role in energy, and I think you've all conceded that it was more about broader integration. Is there any role that energy is playing in ongoing negotiations that both Canada and the U.S. are doing with the EU? And is energy playing a role in that context? And also, how seriously do you think the Canadian government and provincial governments are making a push to diversify exports away from the U.S.? Thank you.
Bob?
Well, I think in the EU free trade agreement, I think Canada raised the issue of the Commission's dislike of oil sands and its punitive directive. It would be punitive if it was put in place, and discriminatory and not based on science.
The fuel quality directive.
The fuel quality directive.
Yeah. Emmis?
I'll address maybe the second part of the question. I think it really varies from province to province. Certainly in a province like Alberta, where the challenge is landlocked oil sands, there's a tremendous amount of effort. And one of the things that we've seen, and it's a domestic challenge, as Bob pointed to earlier, is that our policy, in large part, that simple one that you mentioned, has really been predicated, for the most part, on north-south flows of energy. We're not terribly good in Canada at east-west collaboration around things energy since the National Energy Program. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to that, but I think that's one of the reasons why we have seen relatively limited progress in terms of thinking through a national energy strategy, and a lot of challenges on the social acceptability file, or dimension, if you will, when it comes to diversifying exports, energy exports from the United States to international destinations. So that essentially means infrastructure begins to have to flow east-west. And at least historically, it's been a lot easier, a certain pipeline aside, to have infrastructure flow north-south. I mean, Keystone XL wasn't the first pipeline built between Canada and the United States. There were many, many, many prior to that that did not run into the rough ride that Keystone XL has run into. But in Canada, on the east-west front, there are a number of major pipeline proposals, and so there are governments that are, really pushing in that direction. The government of British Columbia is pushing very hard in terms of natural gas exports, LNG exports to Asia, and again, they're reading the tea leaves, seeing that the appetite in the future is not necessarily going to be coming from the U.S., is going to be coming from other international markets. For other provinces, it's less of an issue. If you're Quebec and your major energy export is hydro, you're not going to be able to export out of North America, right? Your market is New England, it's New York, and so there's a real focus on trying to expand, as was mentioned earlier, the hydroelectricity exports into the United States. So the short answer is it really depends as you go across province to province, and particularly the ones that are oil and gas producers. That's where you're going to see more interest in the international diversification.
As far as the free trade agreement with Europe, we're in discussions. I think both sides want on different things. We're still in that conversation. I think obviously the main issue on energy when it comes to the discussion with Europe right now is natural gas exports, because our law, somewhat arcane, makes a distinction in the approval process for licensing for exports of natural gas, depending whether you are a free trade agreement country or not. So obviously the incentive for Europe is to have a free trade agreement that puts all of Europe, 28 countries, in that category of destinations that don't need a lengthy approval process. As far as the actual exports, where they'll go, I think there's a lot of discussion where American exports will go, but I think part of this is we have no idea yet. This is a market that has not been created yet. We have some Asian customers that have already purchased. We have to see which other facilities will get licenses, which will actually be built, how many of them will export up to the actual maximum level that is allowed by the license, and how many of them will say, I don't actually have the gas to export. And then how will the trading start? Because it's not just going to be direct links, as we're seeing, BG signing a contract. It's not for direct links necessarily, but they're a trading company. And they're going to buy from one place and sell in another, and it won't necessarily be the same molecules that go from point A to point B. And so we're going to have to wait and see how this market develops and see how the American gas exports end up affecting the market.
A health warning on natural gas in North America. Whenever you see the North American natural gas community, producers or whatever, all bunch up and coalesce, convinced, and arriving at a consensus about a certain future, rest assured that they're like a herd of buffalo about to go over a cliff. It's happened time and time again. Just read the National Petroleum Council's reports on natural gas in 1991, 1998, 2003, and what they've said recently. Their view of the future, which is a consensus of industry and government and all the modelers and economists and so on, gets turned upside down on its head within a matter of years. The current long discussion among academics, and I'm now one of them, and I'm writing a long paper on the history of national energy strategies and policies in Canada. It started in 2003. In 2003, North America was running out of gas. There were 32 BCF a day of import proposals, LNG. Last year, were 34 BCF a day of export proposals. That's 60 some odd, close to 70. The current lower 48 production is 71 BCF a day. I mean, how in just the course of a few years can we be so clever in government and academia to set out in a free market environment to say we're going to have a discussion about an energy future or an energy strategy? Governments should put in place the rules of the game, the framework conditions to allow private investment to take place. There are key issues in Canada in terms of developing our prodigious but high-cost energy resources. And we haven't talked about one of the most important, and that's the agenda item that was left undone since Christopher Columbus came here. Europeans came here for the stuff, right? They never cut the locals in on the deal. And that has been ignored from Alaska to Terra del Fuego. And we are now reaping the results of that policy ignorance, if you like. And the First Nations have a long and very tight corpus of Supreme Court decisions that give them pretty well authority in terms of authorizing or approving natural resource developments in Canada, because they tend to live where the natural resources are. This is a huge public policy issue that we're grappling with in Canada. And I don't think very many people understand how serious it is.
We have a name for that reverse indicator thing. It's called the economist cover syndrome, because as soon as they declare us out of oil, we find a whole lot more, or it's now going to, it goes backwards. And I think Monica has given us the new big technology, horizontal shipping across the country. Yeah. Back here, the very attractive man with the dark hair, yeah.
Hi, Jerry Cunningham, Bungie Global Markets. About 3 weeks or so ago, I saw Jack Gerard, the president of the API, on TV, and he made he gave an interesting historical context for the duration and the delay of approval of the Keystone Pipeline. According to Mr. Gerard, it's taken about as long as it took to build the Transcontinental Railroad back in the 1800s, to sort of give it a historical perspective. And especially in an environment where everyone recognizes the need for energy security. My question, however, is that if you view U.S.-Canada relations only from that perspective, you would say it would be highly antagonistic. And my question to the whole panel, 2 Americans and 2 Canadians, is how would you rate U.S.-Canadian relations today? I mean, including Keystone's part of it, but it's not the relationship in its entirety. How would you view that relationship? Has it gotten weaker? Has it gotten stronger? Is it about the same as it was prior to the president taking office? So looking at everything, how would you rate how the U.S. and Canada are getting along?
With or without the Olympic hockey game?
I'll have you say that. I think the state of the relationship is excellent. I think Canada and the United States have a very good relationship. We collaborate on everything. If you take the fact that we have disagreements on policy every once in a while, that's a healthy thing. But in principle, I can't think of a closer relationship or one that we could make even closer, and we keep trying. But from the world stage to our efforts on a variety of issues of national security, of economic integration, and just an overall relationship issue, I think it's excellent, and it is as good as it's ever been.
I have another note.
I disagree.
It says,
You may.
we are out of time, and then it says, Amos has to go. I don't know whether it was something you said or that you have a plane to catch.
I think it was that last statement.
Would you please join me in thanking 3 excellent speakers?